Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to our webinar today. For those of you who have not joined us for previous installments, this is Implementation and Equity 201, The Path Forward to Complete Streets, a webinar series focused on exploring different aspects of complete streets through the themes of equity and implementation. Through this webinar, we've explored a variety of topics that bring different disciplines into the fold of complete streets, including public health, economic return, Vision Zero, walkable main streets, and many more topics. You can explore all of our previous webinars on our blog. Today's webinar will focus on the impact of emerging technologies on complete streets, and we're joined today by Stantec and by the Smart Cities Collaborative, a program of our sister program, Transportation for America. My name is Heather Zuccaro. I am the Health Program Associate here at the National Complete Streets Coalition, and I'm just here today to provide a brief introduction to the topic, and then I'll return at the tail end of the program to moderate our question and answer portion. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you should see a chat box. Please use the chat box to type in any questions that you have for our participants. Today's topic, as I mentioned, is the impact of emerging technologies on complete streets. And we really are faced today with the crux of great change, and not for the first time either. Over the entire history of transportation, as technology has continued to change and improve, so too have we changed the way that we build, use, and think about our roads. Even beginning with something as simple as the shift from using animals and just foot for travel to bringing in simple technologies like wheeled push carts and horses and buggies required us to change the materials that we use to build and pave our roads. As motorized transportation has arisen, we've changed the way that we control our streets. We've had to think more in depth about controlling the flow of traffic and how we communicate the rules of the road. And we've also had to think about how we share the road between faster-moving motorized vehicles and slower-moving active transportation methods such as walking and cycling. This has led largely to a shift from the street as a shared public space to a space that's subdivided between the different uses. Today, we travel farther and faster than ever before. The automobile has given rise to the suburbs where we can commute quite a far distance to get to work each day. And it's also meant that for the convenience of cars and the safety of all users of the road, we have separated out pedestrians and bicyclists, in some cases not providing facilities for these users at all. Here at the National Complete Streets Coalition, we advocate for policies and practices that allow us to consider the needs of all users of the road, regardless of age, ability, or mode of transportation. We work towards creating a comprehensive transportation network that gives transportation options so that people can get where they need to go through a variety of paths. However, this work does not happen in a static environment. Technology today continues to change and improve. And here today, we're going to discuss what technologies are emerging, how they will change the transportation system, and how we can harness these technologies to improve the safety and mobility of users of all ages and all abilities. I'm joined today by two speakers. The first is Rod Shabesh. Rod is the Vice President and the Connected and Automated Vehicles Program Lead at Stantec. Rod has spent his 26-year career enhancing mobility. He specializes in the implementation of new transportation technology and in understanding how that technology will transform North American transportation networks. With a focus on building smarter cities, Rod is always striving to find greater infrastructure efficiencies that positively impact the built environment. He has led projects involving automated vehicles, transit rideshare technology, driverless shuttles, and smart cities planning. Currently, he is serving as Stantec's program manager for Active Aurora, Canada's largest connected automated vehicles testbed, and is leading the creation of Canada's first smart corridor in Edmonton. Rod, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about something that I'm very passionate about and very excited to share with everybody on the call. So we're going to focus on the new mobility and the built environment. So Heather's done a great job kind of leading us into some of the changes that's going on with this new technology. So let's get right at it. So as some of the previous photos that Heather showed, transportation has changed a lot over the last 150 years, but it hasn't actually changed a whole lot over the last 30 or 40. If you think of the big changes, when we went from horse and buggy to Model T, that was a huge change. But transportation in general hasn't changed a lot, but it's about to. And it's the best way to compare it is to look at how your phone was 15, 20 years ago and what your phone does now. It's basically fully embraced technology, and its capabilities and how it influences the way we live has been a very huge transformation. Our vehicles and the way we get around cities and the way we deal with our transportation systems are just about to start that similar type of transformation. And if you can imagine how exciting that this will be, it's a tremendous change, and look forward to chatting here a little bit more about some of these specific examples and how it's going to affect our built environment. So just really quickly, from a historical context, everyone can relate to this. But for the most part, and these are fairly general statements, but transit historically in the North American context has been something that has been probably not the best used mode of getting people around. Relatively high cost per passenger. The cost of the driver adds to a high operating cost. There's very little time savings, and one of the big challenges with most transit, particularly lower orders, buses and that type of mode, is that it doesn't deal with the first mile, last mile of your trip. There are definitely exceptions to the rule. There are a number of centers. New York comes to mind, of course, with their subway system, which is handling tremendous volumes of people and has really allowed the island of Manhattan to develop the way it is. But for the most part, across North America, it's not been. It hasn't really been what it could be. What has happened, of course, is the automobiles is taken control, and automobiles have really impacted the way cities have developed over the last 40 or 50 years, and then some. What's interesting about cars, of course, is that they sit idle most of the time, over 94% of the time. Most people use their automobile for all their personal trips. And the other interesting thing is most people don't think about it, but to operate and own a car, an average person costs about $8,500 per year. I think most of us don't even blink an eye about that cost. It's just part of living in our lives. But it is a significant cost. The other thing, of course, that's happened with the automobiles is had a huge impact on land use. And it doesn't take much to look at our cities now and look at the way that they've developed over the years, particularly in the peripherals and the sprawl that's associated with single-use automobiles, individual homes, and the subdivisions that come along with it. The other thing that's astonishing is the number of parking spaces that every single car has at its disposal, 3.4 of them. So there's an awful lot of surface in our cities that are covered with asphalt so that we can park our cars, even though there's 3.5 times as many stalls as there are cars. So technology. So what are we talking about in terms of technology? Well, there's two main ones, and then the third one I'm going to elaborate on. The first one is automated vehicles, and automated vehicles is much like it's somewhat synonymous with autonomous, but I'm going to use the term automated. That's sort of the technology or the terminology that the United States Department of Transportation has identified and is correct. We'll talk about connected vehicles, again, at a very high level to explain sort of what it all involves and the differences of it. And then we'll move into shared automated vehicles, or basically driverless shuttles. So automated vehicles, I'm not going to talk much about this. I think the key thing for people to understand, if you don't already know, I'm sure many of you do, but just want to make sure the basics are covered here, that these automobiles basically drive themselves, and they do it through the collection of information obtained from the vehicle itself. And that's really important. So it basically has a LiDAR system. It's scanning its surroundings very quickly. It's creating a 3D point cloud. It's got algorithms that know where it is relative to other objects, and it makes decisions in terms of where it's driving based on the information that the scanner can reach out and see. But what it can't see around corners. It can't see across the city. It can only see what it can see nearby. Now, connected vehicles, on the other hand, is a different system altogether. Connected vehicles is basically where an automobile has a device in it, and that device allows it to talk to other similar devices. So any other vehicles that have a similar device, they can talk to each other. These devices can also be placed along the roadside. So you can put them on a street light, you can put them on a signal controller, you can put them on the side of a highway, and as the vehicle drives by, the vehicle will literally communicate with the other device. And from that information, it collects the vehicle's information as it travels by in terms of where it is, its speed, and where it is in space. And then all that information can be transferred to a traffic management center, which is a key thing, which then allows large cities and large communities to be able to have in real time, a map that shows all the vehicles on a street and moving in real time. And so from that map and from that display, they can see where the congestion is. They can see if there's an accident or an emergency situation. And what's also powerful with this technology is it's a two-way communication stream. So the traffic management center, once it recognizes that there's a big picture issue, it can then send messages back through the whole network back to the individual cars on the street and say, hey, you know what, there's an accident up here. Let's reroute you around, or let's move out of the way to allow an emergency vehicle to go by. And that's very powerful from a mechanism to manage congestion and to move people around more efficiently within the infrastructure we already have. Now, shared automated vehicles is basically, they're automated vehicles, but they're basically little minibuses. And there's a number of different manufacturers that are producing these. And I think as time goes on, there will be a lot more of the OEMs and other vehicle manufacturers that will come on and design and build similar types of vehicles that really can be used for various applications based on demand. But in general terms, these vehicles are vehicles that they basically have seating for anywhere between 6 and 12 people. Some are a little bit larger. There's no driver in the vehicle. There's no steering wheel. All you do is the door opens like a little bus, and you walk into it. They are ADA compliant, so there is ramps for those that need that. And they do operate as an automated vehicle. They can go on a fixed route, or they can travel in mixed traffic. So one SAV can effectively replace 12 conventional vehicles, which is pretty powerful. This is kind of typical things for any kind of transit vehicle, but keep in mind that they also can handle a lot of people per day. They eliminate parking stalls and the need for them, and then they're just a general, much more efficient way to transport people from a cost perspective per mile. So what are these emerging technologies? How are they going to impact cities? Well, they're going to affect the way cities operate. They're going to be able to help accommodate the growth and the ongoing growth that cities are experiencing from the general urbanization. They'll also be able to help manage congestion by getting more people into shuttles, get them out of their cars, particularly in dense urban areas, which should improve the economy and eliminate waste and time spent in congestion. Safety will improve because when it's automated, the risk of collisions between pedestrians and vehicles and cyclists and vehicles will go down significantly. It will save time for society and in general improve the quality of life. Now, one of the questions might be, well, it's great, this technology, when is it coming? Well, it's here now. They are being deployed in many different locations around the nation, and that deployment is ramping up. And there's a lot of different manufacturers that are jumping on to try to get involved with this. But I believe these SAVs are going to be deployed in advance of traditional automated vehicles. So what do the benefits have to the built environment and from a complete street perspective? Well, certainly, as you can imagine, if you've got a system that allows you to move people through a downtown core more efficiently than single occupant vehicles, and keep in mind that these shuttles are they don't require a whole lot of infrastructure to operate. You can now suddenly look at land use and look at intensifying land use accordingly. From a public realm design, I should say that these SAVs operate at lower speeds. Maximum speed would be about 25 miles per hour, but certainly could go slower, maybe 15 to 20 miles per hour. So they can operate in corridors that are primarily pedestrian or cyclist involved. You can start looking at closing streets down and using them as a way to still have fairly significant throughput with having multiple shuttles operating along them. But that allows that street suddenly to be taken back from the automobile and turned into more of one that's more related to the public realm and pedestrians and sort of a more greener people environment. From an equity perspective, it certainly helps because without a driver in the vehicle, as I mentioned earlier, 65 to 70% of the cost of operating a bus is the driver. If you don't have one, there's a huge cost savings from an operations perspective. Infrastructure, these shuttles do not require heavy rail installed in the pavement. They do not need overhead catenary. All they basically need is for a station, you can put a sign up, you can do very minimal modifications. You can build elaborate stations, but you don't necessarily need to. They're very dynamic. They can pull in and out wherever they need to be. And they just provide a lot of flexibility without a lot of cost. So you can also try them as a trial pilot and see how they operate and gradually introduce them into your cities. From a health and safety perspective, once you get people out of their cars, in the first place, people are going to be walking more. They're going to be taking more steps. As the proliferation of health watches come on stream, people are going to be looking for opportunities to get more steps in, and these will help with that. And again, the key thing with these shuttles is that they really do enhance existing transit networks. They provide access to the first mile, last mile, which is a key part of it. The other big benefit with these shuttles is the impact it has on TODs, or transit-oriented developments. TODs typically are those developments located adjacent to or within a short walk of a transit station, typically a higher order transit station, an LRT, a subway, or potentially a BRT. What these shuttles allow developers and cities to do now is to, instead of looking at a very confined location for a TOD, and typically TOD locations are the land use policies allow greater density. Now all of a sudden, with the implementation of a shuttle or two, you can develop a parcel, let's say a city block that's maybe 10, 15 blocks off a mass transit station, and use a SAV to connect that development with a mass transit station that's 10 blocks away. And by doing that now, suddenly it's turned that parcel of land into a TOD, which allows the developer then to go to the city and say, hey, I'd like to add more density, and maybe at the same time I'd like to reduce my parking requirements. And so what does that mean? Well, of course, it means the development becomes less expensive to build because the reduction in underground parking. And furthermore, it's less expensive because the number of units you can get on that same parcel of land goes up. So that allows the price of units to go down, which helps with equity and densification of cities. And that SAV deployment can then be linked with other developers in the area or other points of interest and start to create little mini loops that can enhance transit system within the built environment. As I mentioned, parking will go down, and in general, we need to eliminate parking minimums. We should really be thinking about, as our cities develop, we should be really trying to plan to phase out parking. There's going to be a lot more. Obviously, a lot of the garages are there, may continue to be there. We will need places for parking some of these vehicles and charging them, but either the redevelopment of them or using existing parking to allow new developments to have no parking as the demands for parking decrease is another strategy. And if we do have to build any parking structures, please build them so that they can be turned over into other uses when parking demands go down in the near future, so that we can do a future retrofit accordingly. And surface lots can be parks for tomorrow's developments. And I think I've talked about this already in terms of the benefits of all this is that it will bring down costs for developers, which will add to improvements for affordable housing and improve the opportunities from an equity perspective. With automated vehicles in general, because they're driven by computers, you don't need the factor of safety, so to speak, to allow for humans that sometimes meander within the lane or get distracted from their phones or other distracted driving tendencies. So you could narrow your street lanes from 12 feet down to possibly even 7 feet wide lanes. You end up with a much more ability to save space in your cross-section to provide more room for the public realm from a complete street opportunity. This is a tremendous opportunity to look at the way you can redevelop and rechange and plan new streets for the future. And not just the future, it's now. We need to be doing this now. Coupled with some of the other issues that we need to be considering is drop-offs. These shuttles will require, much like at airports now, if you think of the Uber and Lyft drop-off zones, they're very congested. We need to be thinking about that and planning not just our streets, but even our building designs around drop-offs and the way people are going to get their transportation as the transportation sector and industry becomes more of a shared type of service, and mobility as a service becomes much more commonplace. They can also be used for goods movement and help with mobility. So again, SAVs, what they do is they really enhance transit, which is, I think, obviously very key, and they're key for the first mile, last mile. They also help with things like paratransit, and those, again, I mentioned the ADA, they are ADA compliant, so seniors and with the baby boomers moving into, as they're aging, the need for ways of getting them around when they lose their driver's license. This is going to help revolutionize the way seniors are continue to live and possibly stay longer in their homes and improve their quality of life. And again, they definitely promote healthier lifestyles, create much more exciting places from a placemaking perspective. They reinforce walking and biking. They improve air quality as we get more people out of the vehicles, and it's just really exciting. Now, there is one downside with CAVs, connected automated vehicles, and that's the risk of people taking their own vehicles or a connected vehicle and traveling longer distances, or having these vehicles traveling around in cores in congestion just because they don't want to park. And that's where one thing we all need to start thinking about is the implementation of policies that sort of talk about things like a zombie tax, or basically cars that drive around with no driver in them. We want to minimize that. We don't want that to get away on us, and actually increase the number of vehicle miles driven in a city and add to congestion. So that's a key aspect in making this a real successful deployment. And then again, like I said, the real powerful thing with these shuttles and with connected vehicles and automated vehicles in general is that the infrastructure required is very minimal. We have a tremendous amount of infrastructure in our cities that are already there. We've spent decades and decades and trillions of dollars constructing it, and it will continue to be valuable for us. But the implementation of this technology, aside from some roadside units, is very, very minimal, which is really exciting. And that allows the implementation of pilot projects to be something that doesn't cost a lot to try. And I think everyone needs to get out there and start to look at applications within your own communities. So to summarize, benefits: it's sustainable, affordable, provides access to all. It will help accommodate densification of urban areas and will enhance densification, will enhance transit. And now one of the downsides is employment, and this is going to happen anyways, but with the technology, but in terms of drivers and that kind of industry, that's going to be an industry that's going to gradually be reduced in terms of the needs of labor. So, but in the interim, we can deal with some of that through attrition and through having some of the drivers look at maybe initially with SAVs being a concierge, so to speak, to be able to keep an eye on how things go, at least until society accepts them and takes them for granted. And they're very flexible and diverse given their minimal infrastructure requirements. So what should cities do? My last slide here. I got to say it: participate, don't wait. Too many cities, too many agencies are taking the wait-and-see strategy. And honestly, technology is always going to be changing. It's never going to stay stagnant. Waiting is not the right strategy. You want to start to get involved. You want to get some people in your organizations to start understanding what this is going to mean to them. Don't sit back and wait. Don't wait for just the private sector to do it all. I think it's important that partners agencies and governments take a leadership role in this. Take baby steps, go slow, engage partners that, in terms of moving forward, whether it be engineering firms or developers or vehicle manufacturers. And we need to gain stakeholder and public confidence. This is going to be a huge paradigm shift. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is going to happen faster than we think. and it's starting now, and it's really, really exciting. So with that, I think I'm about 2 minutes over. I apologize, but I'm going to pass this back to Heather.
Thank you so much, Rod, for that presentation. For those of you listening in over the phone and watching on your computer, we have a lot of really great questions coming in, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentations today, so keep those questions coming. I will take one brief moment to answer a pretty common question we're getting. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and a full recording of the webinar as well as a PDF of the presentations will be available within the next week or two on our blog. Our next speaker is Russ Brooks. Russ is the Director of Smart Cities for Transportation for America. Last year, Russ launched the Smart Cities Collaborative, bringing together 16 cities to explore how technology can improve urban mobility and tackle the challenges related to implementing smart city policies and projects. Cities in the collaborative receive direct technical assistance, launch pilot projects, and share best practices with the rest of the collaborative to drive best practices across the country. Before Smart Cities, Russ was Transportation for America's Deputy Director and also founded the Urbanful Project, a startup launched to support small batch manufacturers and local businesses, with profits going to support Smart Growth America's work. Prior to joining Transportation for America, Russ also served as the National Director for CABT, an organization focused on freight and highway safety, and was responsible for strategizing, planning, and implementing their state and federal policy agenda, as well as managing the organization's field staff. Russ?
Thanks, Heather. So I'm actually just going to pick up right where Rod left off. I think that was one of the defining questions for us as we started to think about how Transportation for America could get involved in smart cities was, what was the role that we really wanted cities to play as they started thinking about emerging technologies and new transportation models? So, we were actually here sitting around, as we do, thinking about how to get engaged in the smart city concept. And really, right as we were starting to make a decision about how we wanted to move forward, the U.S. Department of Transportation launched their Smart City Challenge. And so, we recognized really quickly that this was going to be a wonderful opportunity and a great catalyst for smart cities, especially around transportation. And so we immediately started reaching out to the cities in our network, and we started partnering and working with them on their initial applications. And really quickly we realized that the U.S. Department of Transportation had pretty severely underestimated how much demand that there was going to be for this grant opportunity. That when you put $40 million on the street with no local match, surprisingly everybody comes out of the woodwork. And so, they are the first ones to say that they thought that they might get 15 or 20 applications, and they got 78. And so really quickly after the first round and the 7 Smart City Challenge finalists were announced, we started thinking about how do we serve those other 71 cities that weren't going to move forward, that they had spent a lot of time, effort, and resources developing plans, thinking about the projects that they wanted to, and we really didn't want them to just sit on the shelf and gather dust. We were also really worried about cities kind of racing forward and not attacking the transportation challenges that they had in their communities. And one of the reasons we thought this was that my colleagues and I sat down and we read all 78 of those initial applications. We spoke with roughly 60 cities as part of that process. And what we heard were a number of themes that both excited us and also concerned us. And, one of the key things that we heard was that cities were really focused on the technology, but they couldn't necessarily tell you why they wanted that technology or what transportation challenge they wanted to use it to solve. So that was one of our first kind of red flags a little bit, was that we wanted them to focus on the vision, figure out what their problems were, what the solutions they wanted to see, and then think about the technologies that they could apply to those challenges. We also noticed that cities, both in the competition and out, knew of equity and accessibility challenges, but it wasn't at the top of their list. And we think that these technologies can have the biggest impact in those situations. They can do the most to open up access and economic opportunity for really everyone in a community. We also noticed that things were different now, that this new innovation, this new wave of innovation that really started with ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft entering our cities, that they really showed that the 20th century regulatory framework didn't really apply anymore, that cities needed to drive the discussion themselves. They needed to be very clear about where they wanted to go, and then they needed to be proactive, as Rod had said, about getting there, and really that they needed to drive the discussion about public-private partnerships and the transportation innovation that was going on in their communities, that those cities that weren't were getting overwhelmed. And so that was a really big part. And part of that comes from a necessary entrepreneurial shift that cities need to take, that there's been a lot of talk in the last decade or so about, certainly since the dot-com boom, about startups and the way that startups approach their business models, and they look at the customer discovery process, and they use things like lean startup to increase their design and their development cycles, that cities needed to take some of those best practices from the private sector and bring them in. They needed to be willing to test and learn, and they needed to be open and transparent about what their progress was, especially when they failed. One of the things that we have learned this year working with cities is that they don't like to talk about their failures, and that a lot of the civil service employees are always worried about the kind of retribution that comes from failed projects, that comes from the media, that comes from the public sector. But we definitely believe that if you are open and transparent about the process that you're going through, as well as the outcomes that you're striving for, that any specific step in the process, nobody gets too hung up on that. So we think that's kind of a key. And lastly, I would say that in order to really harness the collective horsepower of these technologies and really direct them effectively, you need to both collaborate across departments, because a lot of projects don't just deal with transportation. They have other outcomes, and whether they be environmental outcomes or health outcomes or equity outcomes. So they need to be thought of in that context. And then lastly, you need to collaborate across your region. That it's really great if the city of Denver, for example, has a really forward-looking progressive program, but most people who commute into Denver don't start in Denver. So those programs and projects need to be regional in nature, and that cities can be they can lead the visioning process in their communities and help get everybody on the same page. Because it's great, as I said, if a core city works in one way, but if all the other surrounding communities aren't aligned, there's limited benefits that come from that. So those were some of the things that we really saw. And out of those discussions, both with the cities and our analysis of this, we decided to form the Smart City Collaborative. And the idea was just as Heather had said before, which is we wanted to pick a cohort of cities that we thought were dedicated to working on these issues, that were eager and interested in figuring out the solutions, and that wanted to work together, because that was the last thing that we heard as we analyzed those applications and talked to cities, was cities were tired of doing this on their own, that they wanted to work with others. They didn't want to be in a silo. They didn't want to start from scratch at every step. So that was a big focus, was that they wanted to work together. So really, we started with 16 cities in the collaborative, and the idea was that we have tangible outcomes, that this wasn't, I like to joke that we're not a talking group, we're a working group. And the idea was just that. How do we get cities to work together? How do we get them to open source their experience and processes so that when another city wants to learn, that they have a framework to begin with? And we wanted them to develop, like I said, those tangible outcomes for each city. So we wanted them to agree to, or we asked them to agree to developing policies that were ready to implement in their council or their agency, and that they would launch or become pilot ready by the end of this year in their first cohort. So we wanted them to get projects on the ground that modeled the policies that they wanted to see in their communities. So that was a very big part of it. So if you look at here, these are the cities that are involved. The largest city that we have is Los Angeles, but the smallest city we have is Lone Tree, Colorado, which is about 10,000 people. And the idea was that we wanted to look at a number of different cities of all sizes. We wanted to get a sense of the difference between core cities and suburbs. And so those are really the cities that we started with. So, really, the focus areas that we heard from cities that they wanted to work on. So when we were having those 60 phone calls with those cities and we were saying, what are you really interested? What are you excited about? We wanted to know what they were excited about once the money was gone. It's really easy to say that you're going to work on all these things under the sun and everything's interesting and exciting to you when someone else is footing the bill. But once they weren't included in the competition anymore, we wanted to see how their priorities shifted and what they were really committed to working on. And what we heard was really three core areas: automated vehicles, shared mobility, and data analytics. And we thought both those were not only the areas that kind of had the most demand from cities that they wanted to know about, but we thought they really played well together and was a good kind of first step into the space for us as well. So we have three core working groups. They have a roughly 10 to 12 cities in each of those working groups, and that's what we focus on. But as I had said before, these are all really interconnected issues. You cannot talk about automated vehicles without talking about shared mobility, without talking about data analytics, without talking about all the other issues that cities are dealing with around procurement and public-private partnerships and electrification and so on and so forth. So our initial idea is actually that these groups would really work much more independently than they have, but very quickly everybody got kind of mashed together because, as I mentioned, they are really interconnected. So I thought I would just share really quickly a few of the pilots that cities are working on in each of these categories to give you a sense of the types of things that we're trying to tackle in the collaborative. San Francisco was awarded it's got a terrible name, the ATC MTD grant last year from U.S. Department of Transportation and got funding to run automated vehicle pilot on Treasure Island. The whole idea behind the pilot is how do we create that as a car-free space? And so that's what they're testing and what they want to learn about. San Jose has just opened up an automated vehicle RFI, or request for information. They actually are looking for a little bit broader of a concept and want to work with the private sector to help them develop that. There have been a number of pitches or suggestions on different automated vehicle projects, and so they are really being a little bit broader in their approach. In our shared mobility group, Los Angeles has been working on an on-demand microtransit pilot that's focused on an underserved neighborhood, and their idea is really just that they want to create first last mile access and use a small on-demand microtransit vehicle like Rod had shared earlier. Centennial, Colorado just wrapped up the first phase of their project, which is again a first mile last mile connector using a ride-hailing application like Lyft and using an accessible vehicle. Their project was specifically focused on equity, but especially on access for seniors and helping them age in place. So they were a back and forth to their light rail station. The next group is really our data analytics group, and so in Washington, D.C., they have been starting with their district mobility platform, and they really one of the first cities to do a complete inventory of all the data that they're actually collecting so that they can get a better understanding of what is contained in their warehouse, as they call it. And now they're beginning to use that data both to make better planning decisions, to think about how to implement some of these innovative projects, but they're also working to push all of that data to real time as they can. So they've taken a very data-focused approach to their smart city operations. And lastly, Seattle has been putting together what they're calling the Trusted Data Collaborative. And the idea is that they want to be an aggregator and a repository for all transportation data in the city. So they are working on a mobility as a service platform. But behind that platform is this trusted data collaborative that grabs all the data from all public and private transportation providers in the city of Seattle. It's a pretty ambitious effort, but it's also what is setting up the backbone of their future mobility projects. So I would just kind of close by saying that we are in the midst of the most transformational moment in transportation than we've seen in 50 or 60 years. That it may not seem like it, but that these technologies really have tremendous capability to either bring together or pull apart our communities. And so I often think about it in the context of the interstate system. And what you'll see on your screens here is actually a picture of the city of Minneapolis. And that is a picture basically before and after the interstates. And you can see the radical difference in the east, west, and south sides of that picture on how those highways really reshaped our community. And this is actually where I came from. And so I know personally the impacts that the highways had in both raising and destroying a lot of underserved and low-income and minority neighborhoods, but also then serving to put barriers in between those neighborhoods and other communities. So, that's just one thing that I think about. Certainly this is Cincinnati. This is another look that is very much the same. And it may not seem like it, but shared mobility, automated vehicles, data analytics have a tremendous ability to solve our transportation challenges, but also to create new digital barriers and increase the gaps between the transportation haves and the have-nots. Think about if you are creating a system for first mile, last mile access to transit that requires a smartphone, that requires a credit card, that is focused in upper middle class and wealthy neighborhoods, that creates a huge barrier for a large segment of the population to not only enjoy but benefit from these technologies. And candidly, I'm sure a lot of us know, also the city as a whole suffers and our communities suffer as a whole when we don't see that increased opportunity and economic benefits that come from full inclusion with these technologies. So I will turn it back over to Heather, but thank you for the opportunity to just kind of share what the collaborative has been working on for this last year.
Thank you, Russ, for that presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, the audience. We've received so many amazing questions already, and I'll just preface our Q&A by saying that we will certainly not have time to get to all of the great questions we've received. However, we'll be putting out a recap blog post within about a week or two of this webinar, and that will include a bonus Q&A. So don't fret if we don't get to your question today. Our first question, really series of questions, is we've gotten a lot of inquiries about how shared autonomous vehicles sense and communicate with their surroundings. For example, sensing potholes and lane markings on the road, detecting and avoiding crashes with bicyclists and pedestrians, and responding to emergency vehicles that may need to actually pass them. So Russ and Rod, could you comment on how shared autonomous vehicles sense and communicate with their surroundings?
Sure, Heather. It's Rod here. So yeah, the SAVs they don't use any technology that's different than what's being put in the automated or autonomous vehicles. They use a combination of a lot of different devices and systems. There's cameras, there are sensors, there is LiDAR, as I mentioned. So in terms of being able to understand, where the line markings are, if you buy a new car now, they have lane assist technologies that are a standard feature on a lot of vehicles now. In terms of pedestrians or other objects, again, the LiDAR and the scanning creates this 3D image. So it knows what's around it, and it knows where those objects are moving relative to itself, so it can make decisions accordingly. But again, there's nothing new that these SAVs have that other automated or connected vehicles don't have. But typically, they are, at least now, the manufacturers are focused on providing those sensors that allow them to drive as an automated vehicle. There's no reason why they can't also be connected, but the key to that is in order for any vehicle to be connected, ideally, particularly to the V2I or the vehicle to infrastructure side, you want to have these devices on the roadside. And that's where the governments come into, the cities and the municipalities that are the ones who own the rights of way that the roads sit within, and they're the ones that can look at implementing these roadside units that will allow the vehicles to talk to.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how do these technologies allow us to refocus on redesigning streets for pedestrians?
Yeah.
So this is Russ. I think that is a really big question, and I think that should be a requirement. I think a lot of cities are sitting down and thinking about how their right-of-way needs to be to redesign in the light of automated vehicles. I think that a lot of cities are trying to take a pedestrian or people-focused or people-centric approach to their design. But also, I think we still have a lot to learn about how humans and automated vehicles are going to interact and how that should be reflected in the design guidelines. But I think it's really important that as we think about redesigning our rights of way and our public spaces around automated vehicles, that we are actually redesigning them around pedestrians first, and then thinking about how automated vehicles fit into that equation. I think we have for too long minimized the design guidelines around pedestrians and people.
I would just add one other comment to that. I think that cities should be looking at a staged approach that as time goes on, they can look at identifying, one corridor or eventually two or three that are pedestrian or SAV only corridors. And I think that will go a long ways to, even if it's done only certain times of the week, maybe on weekends initially, maybe during non-peak periods, given the fact that there's very little infrastructure requirements to implement or to pilot, I think it's a pretty powerful tool to be able to see how a city and how a street can transform into a different type of environment when it's not covered with automobiles traveling at higher speeds, but into a much more warmer, inviting environment with a combination of more streetscaping and patios and sort of a public feel to them.
Our next question is, how do you see these technologies working in small towns and cities in rural areas?
This is Russ. I think that's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different use cases in smaller communities. I think especially in smaller communities that are either lacking transit or struggling to pay for transit, I think that some small communities that we know of are looking at business models for how the city could run a fleet of automated vehicles to complement, to serve as a bona fide transit network, right-sized vehicles, and so on and so forth. I think it offers great opportunity for seniors to age in place in smaller communities in a way that they struggle to now, to get to cultural items, to get to healthcare, to get to continuing education and other things. But I think, frankly, given the resources that small communities have, it is really going to be difficult for them to put the time, effort, and resources into it as quickly as some of the larger cities can. So I think some of those questions are still to be determined.
I would add that one of the powerful aspects of SAVs and connected automated vehicles in general is that there isn't a lot of capital infrastructure requirements. So if a small community wanted to implement a transit system where they were struggling with being able to afford it, or the idea of recognizing that there's not a huge capital cost initially, and again, if they're driverless, you lose the cost of the operator of a bus, which is, like I said before, about 65 to 7% of the operating cost. It's actually quite cost effective to implement as a pilot a corridor where one of these shuttles could operate back and forth And again, if it's a smaller town, the congestion levels are less, so it would probably be easier to implement, and there would be less conflict points and less resistance. So depending on, again, the clients, the stakeholders along the corridor, whether they're supportive or not, I think the opportunities are still very real. And but I just think a lot of the attention is in the bigger cities because the challenge of congestion is much greater in bigger cities than in smaller communities.
Our next question concerns first and last mile specifically. If shared and autonomous vehicles are actually aiming to support these connections, does that put them in competition with walking and biking? More broadly, how might these vehicles and the convenience of shared AV mobility impact opportunities for active transportation and public health?
Yeah, I would. That's a good question, and there probably is definitely risks associated with that. Although I would make the argument that if you're somebody who walks a fair bit already or uses a bike, I would be surprised that you would give those up to hop on a transit vehicle, because part of it is that you're of the mindset in the first place that you value exercise and you value a sustainable means of getting around. But I think the bigger opportunity, instead of looking at the negative side of that risk, I think the much bigger opportunity is the upside of attracting people to take transit that currently wouldn't consider it, or it's far too inconvenient for them to consider it. So the upside of attracting more people into mass transit versus the downside of detracting ped cyclists is, I think, in the big picture, there's a net benefit. And I would also add that, again, even with the shuttles, if you have shuttles or just AVs in general, that in time, if it's a shared AV, if you don't have a vehicle that you own, that you purchased and invested in, sitting someplace in a city, and you got to go back to it at the end of the day, your mindset and your philosophy of what you do while you're there can change quite a bit. And I think I would argue that people will have a tendency to want to spend more time in the core. They want to stay for dinner. They might want to go see a show or do something, wander around and see things that they wouldn't otherwise see when they just rush to get into their vehicle, knowing that they're getting charged for parking. It's very invigorating, and it really, it's like it's taking the shackles off your feet to be able to run and actually have experience and not necessarily have to have things so planned. So I think that the net benefit greatly outweighs that what I would argue is a relatively small risk.
So this is Ross. I would say that I agree. I do think that I think that all modes are theoretically in competition with all modes all the time. But I do think it's a question of how these vehicles are introduced in our communities, and if we are using them and targeting them at people who are walking and biking, then I think we're targeting them inappropriately. But I think there's a really good example of a shared mobility implementation project going on at Summit, New Jersey. And the idea basically was that the city of Summit did not want to build another parking structure at their New Jersey rail connection. And so instead, they have partnered with Uber to provide first mile, last mile service to those people who were formerly driving and parking. And they've priced it. It is a rush hour service, and they have priced it as the same as parking. So they're really targeting those people who are driving 2, 3, 4, 5 miles in and plus into this heavy rail line and this commuter rail line to get them in. So that's the impression that they want to create around shared mobility in Summit, New Jersey. It's not only encouraging different behavior among those commuters, but it's also actually saving the city a ton of money, and they're not building parking infrastructure and kind of subsidizing driving as a behavior. So in those types of projects, we would also see a really high potential for automated vehicles as well to help complement transit, but really still be targeted at those people who are commuting by vehicle, that are single occupancy vehicle commuters, and aren't likely the people who are walking or biking up to that point.
We just have time for one more question, and we've gotten a couple of questions about design manuals and guidelines. Specifically, how can complete streets guidelines and policies encourage and support the integration of these technologies, and what opportunities are there to improve the language about bicyclists and pedestrians in these design manuals?
That's a bit of a tricky one. I would say that obviously complete street guidelines are well established, and they're focused on building vibrancy of corridors. I think the implementation, if done right and if controlled in the right context, they can greatly enhance the attractiveness of a complete street. As far as the guidelines changing, I think that probably should be reviewed through one of the committees and gradually see how the pilots that are starting to pop up across the nation, to see how they perform, and lessons will be learned as time goes on. But with new technology and starting from scratch here, I think it's a bit of a wait and see to see exactly how we want to implement too restrictive guidelines. I think leaving a little bit of flexibility is probably a good thing.
Thank you all so much for your questions, and thank you, Russ and Rod, for your answers and your presentations. We do have quite a lot of other really great and interesting questions that, as I mentioned, we will get to many of them in our recap blog post, so stay tuned for that. Before we wrap up today, I just want to give a plug for our upcoming webinars. As I mentioned at the top of the call, this webinar series is a monthly recurring series, and our next installment will focus on how private developers and public-private partnerships can support complete streets. It will focus specifically on a project here in Washington, D.C. We'll get the chance to hear from VHB, the National Association of Realtors, and the two parties on either side of that public-private partnership. So join us on October 18th for a panel discussion about public-private partnerships. Stay tuned for more information and the registration link. And if you did not get enough of AV today, there is an AV tweet chat coming up soon. On Wednesday, September 20th, join the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center on Twitter with the hashtag AVChat. We'll be participating as well, so look for us at Complete Streets. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. Thank you again to Russ and Rod. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and we hope that we'll see you at the next one. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.